In the world of radical movements, few are as chilling as the Zizian Cult. What began as an idealistic group focused on animal rights and social justice soon spiraled into a deadly, violent organization. Behind the masks and ideologies was a web of manipulation, deception, and brutality that would leave a permanent scar on society. A simple mission of activism slowly morphed into something unrecognizable. What started as a fight to protect the innocent, to save animals from the horrors of the world, became an all-consuming obsession, one that blurred the lines between right and wrong. The group's leader, once hailed as a voice for change, soon began to lure in followers, promising them a world reborn. But as they listened, they failed to notice the subtle shift from peace to violence, from words to action. The Zizian cult was born out of an ideology, but nurtured in extremism. It wasn't long before the world saw them for what they truly were. Not a movement for justice, but a radical force ready to take control, by any means necessary. By the time the authorities began to piece together their network, it was already too late. The Zizian cult had spread like wildfire, silently, dangerously. The first signs were hidden under layers of deception, with only the faintest traces of their violence left behind. But as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that something far darker was lurking beneath the surface. So, who were they? What drove these individuals to commit such heinous acts? And how far would they go to push their twisted ideology into the world? These are the questions we seek to answer in this chilling documentary. Before we continue, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our latest documentaries and true crime investigations. We've only scratched the surface, and the truth is far from what you might expect. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The origins of the Zizian cult are not as simple as they first seem. Their rise was not inevitable, it was a calculated transformation, driven by a leader whose charm and manipulation would guide a group of idealists into the realm of the radical and the violent. In the early days, the Zizian cult was nothing more than a loosely organized group of activists. Their mission was clear: protect animals, fight for social justice, and change the world. But like so many before them, the road to righteousness took a dark and dangerous turn. The leader, known only as Lasota, emerged as a charismatic figure, a man who could speak to the hearts of the oppressed and give voice to the voiceless. He promised his followers a better world, one where their efforts would lead to the transformation of society. But as the group grew, so did Lasota's ambitions. Soon, the ideology took a turn. The speeches became more radical, the demands more extreme. What once was a movement for peaceful change now became a call for violence. The end goal was no longer justice, it was domination. For Lasota and his followers, the lines between activism and aggression grew blurred. And as the world continued on, unaware of the brewing storm, they set their plans into motion, plans that would change everything. This wasn't just another protest or a peaceful demonstration. This was something much more dangerous. This was a movement that sought not to protest, but to destroy. By the time the authorities began investigating, it was already too late. The Zizian cult had evolved beyond recognition. It was no longer about animal rights or social justice. It was about power, control, revolution. And what came next would not only shock the nation, it would shake the very foundations of trust within society. The Zizian cult's violent campaign would soon leave a trail of destruction, a series of gruesome events that could not be ignored. What started as an idealistic movement had become a nightmare. And the questions remain: how did it get this far? How did they convince so many to follow them, even into the darkest depths of violence? In the coming moments, we'll take you through the timeline of events, the key players, and the investigation that would uncover the truth behind one of the most shocking cults in recent history. What you're about to witness may change the way you look at radical movements forever. It was 2018 when Lasota first began to make a name for himself in the activist community. The Bay Area, known for its progressive stance on social justice issues, became the breeding ground for what would eventually become a violent cult. Small activist groups, once isolated in their causes, were starting to connect online. They gathered under the banners of animal rights, environmentalism, and human equality, but something about Lesoto's rhetoric resonated on a deeper level. Jack Lesota wasn't just any activist. He had an uncanny ability to speak to the heart of societal injustices. His message was simple, yet profound: we cannot wait for change, we must force it. His early speeches, filled with promises of a better world for animals and marginalized communities, drew in crowds eager to make a difference. He spoke passionately about liberation, of animals, of the oppressed, of the world itself. But behind the carefully crafted speeches and the charismatic persona, there was a darker vision lurking. Lesota began to make increasingly bold claims: the system is broken, and no amount of reform will fix it. It was no longer about incremental change. It was about total revolution. At first, the message was subtle. But with every passing speech, Lesota's followers grew more fervent, more desperate for change. The group, known at the time as the Collective, quickly gained traction, attracting young, idealistic individuals who believed they were fighting for a just cause. Animal rights activists, eco-warriors, and social justice advocates found common ground in Lesota's fervor. But the cracks in the movement began to show almost immediately. As Lesota's influence grew, so did the ideology of violence. What began as peaceful protests and online petitions soon escalated into acts of vandalism and sabotage. In Lesota's mind, change was not just a dream, it was an obligation. And to achieve it, the system would have to be destroyed. In the span of just 2 years, Lesota's influence grew exponentially. What was once a loose-knit group of activists was quickly evolving into a militant faction. His speeches, once about peaceful demonstrations, began to focus on direct action, attacking corporations, disrupting city infrastructures, and destabilizing government operations. Violence was no longer a last resort, it became a primary tool of the Zizian movement. But it was Lesota's ability to manipulate his followers that truly set him apart. He understood human psychology, he knew exactly how to make people feel they were part of something bigger than themselves. In many ways, Lesota became a messianic figure for the disillusioned youth. He spoke of a new world, a world that could only come into existence through extreme means. Lesota's early speeches were not just calls for action, they were calls for absolute loyalty. And the Zizian Cult, as it would soon be known, was built on that loyalty, a devotion to Lesota and his radical vision. The idea was simple: disrupt the system by any means necessary. No more protests or petitions. No more civil disobedience. The time for peaceful resistance had passed. The time for war had come. But the shift wasn't just about tactics. It was ideological. Lesota began to weave together a complex narrative that justified violence. In his view, the world had reached a point of no return. The oppressors, those in power, the corporations, and the government, had shown their true colors. They would never listen to reason. So, the only way to achieve change was through chaos. Lesota's followers, in turn, began to see themselves not as activists, but as soldiers in a war against the system. Lesota's calls to arms weren't just about violence, they were about sacrifice. His followers were told that their actions were righteous, that their bloodshed was the price for true liberation. And as the movement grew, so did the group's commitment to Lesota's cause. By the end of 2020, the collective had evolved into the Zizian Cult, a name that would soon strike fear in the hearts of many. Their ideology was no longer about justice, it was about domination. They no longer sought to change the world, they wanted to reshape it entirely. So, what drove Lesota to make such a radical transformation? Was he truly a man of noble intentions, corrupted by power, or was this always part of his plan? To understand the full extent of the Zizian cult's rise, we need to look deeper into Lesota's past, his motivations, and the psychology that led him to build a cult built not on love and justice, but on destruction and chaos. At its core, the Zizian cult claimed to fight against the oppression of all living beings. What began as a movement dedicated to ending animal cruelty, advocating for the voiceless creatures of the world, slowly transformed into something far darker. What started with the righteous cause of animal rights began to spiral into an ideology that justified violence against anyone who stood in their way. But how did this shift occur? How did a movement focused on compassion become one fueled by hatred and destruction? The answer lies in the cult's core beliefs and the dangerous radicalization that took place behind closed doors. The first signs of this transformation began with the group's increasing focus on the oppressors. Lasota, in his speeches, started to refer not just to corporations or institutions but to entire groups of people. He painted a broad picture, labeling anyone who profited from exploitation, be it of animals, the environment, or marginalized communities, as the enemy. This enemy, as the Zizian cult saw it, had to be eradicated. The term human oppressors became a rallying cry within the group. For Lasota, it was not enough to simply expose the systems that exploited animals, the individuals behind these systems, the rich, the powerful, and those who perpetuated what he saw as injustice, were to be punished. Lasota's rhetoric grew increasingly violent as he began to push the idea that these oppressors had to be eliminated, that any form of reform or peaceful resolution was futile. Only through total destruction, he argued, could true freedom be achieved. As Lasota's power grew, so did the cult's beliefs. Members began to adopt the radical notion that their violence wasn't just justified, it was necessary. They viewed themselves as soldiers in a holy war against human oppression, using whatever means they saw fit to advance their cause. And while they continued to present themselves as defenders of animal rights, the lines blurred, becoming harder to distinguish between those who stood for justice and those who would be deemed enemies. The Zizian cult's manifesto, circulated among members and sympathizers, expanded this ideology further. Animal rights were no longer their sole focus. The manifesto made it clear, this was a fight for all oppressed beings, from animals to the disenfranchised human populations. But with every new page of radical rhetoric, the cult's targets expanded beyond corporations to include anyone who challenged their vision of freedom. In these early days, the lines between activism and extremism became harder to draw. What had been peaceful protests, calls for animal rights laws, and campaigns to stop factory farming quickly devolved into discussions of violent tactics, direct action meant to disrupt and, at times, destroy. The cult's ideology, once focused on positive change, began to be framed as a fight for survival. For the Zizian cult, violence became not a last resort but a necessity, and the group began to take increasingly dangerous steps toward achieving their radical goals. This shift in ideology marked a critical turning point for the group. While Lasota and his followers still justified their actions under the banner of animal rights, the growing influence of extremist beliefs would soon push them towards something far darker. The Zizian cult was no longer just a group of activists, it was evolving into a dangerous, militant force that sought to tear down the existing world order to rebuild it in their image. So, where did this ideology come from? Was it born out of frustration, desperation, or was it carefully crafted by Lasota to manipulate his followers? And more importantly, what kind of world was he trying to create, a world where violence was the only means of achieving freedom? In the months that followed, these beliefs would begin to manifest in terrifying ways, actions that would challenge the very foundations of society. But it wasn't just the ideology that made the Zizian cult dangerous, it was the radical shift in how they saw themselves and their mission. The world, as they saw it, was no longer a place for negotiation. It was a battleground. In 2022, the Zizian cult claimed responsibility for a brutal attack in the heart of San Francisco. The victim? A local landlord, who the cult accused of exploiting tenants and contributing to the gentrification of the area. But this wasn't just a protest gone wrong, it was the first deadly escalation in the cult's campaign for justice. The attack took place on a crisp autumn evening. The landlord, a 58-year-old man named Roger Price, was found outside his multi-unit building, lying in a pool of blood. He had been brutally assaulted, his body showing signs of prolonged torture. The message was clear: this was no random act of violence. The Zizian cult had decided that Price, whom they viewed as a symbol of capitalist greed, had to pay the price for his supposed crimes. Price's attack marked a turning point. The cult, once operating in the shadows, now sought the public spotlight. Lesoto's call for action had reached a fever pitch, and his followers were emboldened. The violence wasn't merely about defending the oppressed, it was about punishing the oppressors in the harshest possible way. But it wasn't just the brutality of the attack that shocked the community, it was the cold, calculated nature of it. Price was lured to the property under the guise of a meeting with a tenant group. When he arrived, he was ambushed by several cult members who had been hiding in plain sight, posing as tenants of his building. What followed was a merciless assault, intended to send a message. The Zizian cult's message was clear: violence was their answer. They didn't want to be ignored any longer. Their manifesto, once theoretical, had now turned into a bloody call for justice. And with the death of Roger Price, a new chapter in the cult's history was written. One that would mark the beginning of an all-out war against what they saw as the injustices of the world. The murder, however, wasn't just an isolated act of vengeance. It was a statement. Lesota and his inner circle had long argued that the existing systems of power and wealth were corrupt, and that those who profited from these systems, like landlords, corporations, and governments, deserved no mercy. The cult believed they were the only ones capable of bringing about a new world order, one where true justice prevailed. As police arrived on the scene, they found little evidence linking the attack to the Zizian cult directly, at least not immediately. But soon after, online forums associated with the group were flooded with messages celebrating the murder. The messages were riddled with revolutionary slogans, praising the attack as an act of liberation. The cult had claimed its first victim, and in doing so, had crossed a line that many thought they would never dare to cross. The Zizian cult was now a force to be reckoned with. And what had started as a battle for animal rights had become a full-fledged war against society's power structures. The question now was how far they were willing to go, and what kind of devastation they would bring in their wake. In the years that followed the brutal San Francisco attack, the Zizian cult did not retreat into the shadows. Instead, they grew stronger, more dangerous. Their ideology spread like wildfire, finding fertile ground in the hearts of disillusioned youth, activists, and others who felt betrayed by the system. With a powerful digital platform at their disposal, the cult's propaganda machine became more sophisticated, attracting new members across the country. What began as a localized movement in California soon evolved into a nationwide recruitment campaign. The cult utilized social media, message boards, and online forums to spread their extreme ideologies, blending radical environmentalism with vehement anti-establishment rhetoric. They spoke of a society ravaged by greed, where corporations and governments oppressed the masses, and where only radical, violent action could restore balance. The digital landscape provided the perfect stage for the cult's expansion. They posted slickly produced videos calling for revolution and liberation, with charismatic speeches from Lesota rallying followers to take action. The time for peaceful protests is over, Lesota proclaimed in one infamous video. The oppressors have left us no choice but to fight back. Justice is not given, it is taken. The content was shared widely, often going viral among young activists, social justice warriors, and those disillusioned with mainstream politics. They weren't just recruiting, they were indoctrinating. The cult's rhetoric made it seem as though they were the only ones who truly understood the injustice plaguing society. It wasn't long before they began seeing a steady stream of new faces. By 2024, the Zizian cult's influence had spread far beyond California. They had recruited members from nearly every state in the Union. And with each new member, the group's reach and danger grew. They set up cells, small, secretive factions in cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. Each cell operated independently, but they all followed Lesota's violent agenda. But how did the cult recruit so effectively? Their tactics were calculated. They preyed on vulnerable people, those who felt powerless or unheard. University campuses became prime targets. The cult's flyers, often disguised as environmental awareness materials, could be found posted on bulletin boards in student centers. On the surface, they looked like harmless activism for animal rights, but the deeper message was unmistakable: radical revolution was the only path forward. At rallies and protests, members of the Zizian cult would infiltrate existing movements, wearing the guise of passionate activists. They knew how to manipulate the social justice conversation, subtly steering it toward their own violent, anti-government ideals. The message was clear: they were the true revolutionaries, fighting for justice in a world that had failed to deliver it. For some, the transition from activism to violence was swift. They were drawn in by the promise of belonging, of being part of something bigger than themselves. For others, it was a slow burn. As the cult's influence grew, the line between activism and terrorism became more blurred. But it wasn't just online propaganda that helped the Zizian cult spread. They also hosted recruitment events, underground meetings where prospective members were taught the cult's radical philosophies. At first, these gatherings appeared innocuous: workshops on environmental issues, veganism, or anti-capitalist protests. But as the hours wore on, the rhetoric became increasingly violent. Revolution is inevitable, Lesotho would declare. And those who oppose us must be silenced. One ex-member, who left the cult after witnessing its darker side, recalls the pressure to conform. At first, it was empowering. It felt like we were fighting for something real, they said. But over time, it became clear that the only path forward was violence. They weren't just talking about changing the system, they were talking about destroying it completely. The allure of the Zizian cult wasn't just its promises of radical change, it was the feeling of belonging, of being part of an exclusive, elite group with a clear purpose. In a fractured society, the cult offered something that many people desperately wanted: a sense of control. But what they failed to realize was that the cost of that belonging was steep, too steep for anyone to truly understand until it was too late. In January 2025, the Zizian cult had escalated their actions to a chilling new level. This time, it wasn't just an attack on a symbol of authority, it was the murder of one of their own targets, David Maland, a border patrol agent in Vermont. His body was discovered in a remote area near the Canadian border. The brutality of his death would forever alter the investigation, revealing just how deeply the cult had embedded itself in the fabric of American society. The circumstances surrounding Maland's death were alarming. The scene was eerily methodical, his body found in a secluded part of Vermont's dense forests, far from any well-traveled roads. The cult had always been known for its cryptic messages, but this murder spoke volumes about their growing power and their willingness to take extreme action. At first glance, it seemed like another isolated tragedy, another life lost at the hands of an invisible enemy. But when the investigators arrived, the scene revealed something much darker. Maland's body was carefully positioned, and evidence around the site pointed directly to the cult's involvement. It became clear, this wasn't just a random attack, this was calculated, deliberate, and part of a larger plan. Maland had been assigned to patrol the northern border for months, watching for illegal crossings and human trafficking. As the investigation unfolded, it became apparent that the Zizian cult had long seen law enforcement as one of their primary enemies. Maland, being a border patrol agent, represented everything they despised: authority, law, and order. But this was more than just a message to law enforcement. The murder was a statement, a declaration that the cult would stop at nothing to achieve their goals. In the weeks leading up to Maland's death, several reports surfaced of suspicious activities near the border. Locals reported seeing strange vehicles late at night and hearing noises from the forest, but none of them could have anticipated the horror that would unfold. What made Maland's death so significant wasn't just the brutality of it, it was what it revealed about the cult's methods. They were no longer content with hiding in the shadows. Their tactics had evolved. This wasn't just a political message. This was personal. The investigation quickly revealed chilling details. Surveillance footage from nearby checkpoints showed a black van entering the area just hours before Maland's death. That same van was later spotted near the location where Maland's body was discovered. Forensics would later confirm that the van was linked to a series of cult-related incidents across the country. As the authorities pieced together the puzzle, it became clear that this was part of a larger, coordinated effort. The Zizian cult had planned the murder meticulously, using their knowledge of the terrain, their ability to evade law enforcement, and their deep sense of conviction to carry out this killing. And they were not afraid to escalate their violence even further. The shockwaves from Maland's death rippled through the investigation. What was once a case about animal rights extremists had now become a full-blown domestic terrorism threat. The FBI, who had been tracking the Zizian cult for over a year, now had a concrete link to a murder, and it wasn't just any murder, it was a murder that had exposed the cult's ability to strike anywhere, at any time. And yet, despite the mounting evidence, the cult's network remained elusive. Investigators struggled to make progress, as the Zizian cult continued to operate in the shadows, their digital presence more active than ever. But for the first time, they had a lead, a murder victim, a location, and a clear motive. David Maland's murder marked a turning point in the investigation. It would become the catalyst for a nationwide manhunt, one that would see law enforcement pursuing the Zizian cult like never before. But it also raised unsettling questions about the cult's reach and how much longer they could continue to operate without being stopped. In the wake of his death, a question hung in the air: how many more lives would be lost before the cult was finally exposed? And how far would the Zizian cult go in their fight against a system they saw as corrupt and oppressive? For years, the Zizian cult operated in the shadows. Their radical beliefs, masked by encryption and anonymity, made them nearly impossible to track. But after the brutal murder of Border Patrol agent David Maland in January 2025, it became clear that the cult had escalated beyond what anyone could have anticipated. For the first time, law enforcement was forced to confront the full scope of the threat they posed. Initially, the investigation was sluggish. The Zizian cult, though violent and radical, had remained under the radar of most intelligence agencies. Their digital presence was carefully concealed, their communications encrypted and disguised under layers of misdirection. They operated on encrypted messaging apps, in private forums, and behind multiple firewalls, making them nearly invisible to the authorities. The FBI's first breakthrough came when they traced the black van seen near the scene of David Maland's murder. Surveillance footage showed the vehicle entering a secluded area in Vermont just hours before the body was discovered. But even this lead was murky. The vehicle had been rented under a fake name, and the tracking system was disabled the moment it crossed state lines. The investigators quickly realized that they were not just dealing with a local extremist group, they were facing a well-organized, highly secretive network capable of operating across state lines. They had successfully avoided detection for years, operating in small cells and using sophisticated methods to stay hidden. This was no ordinary criminal group. This was a movement. The FBI's initial response was hampered by the lack of concrete evidence. For years, the cult had managed to stay one step ahead. Their digital presence was minimal, carefully curated to avoid detection. Investigators struggled to make sense of the fragmented pieces of information they had, disconnected reports from witnesses, encrypted files, and vague social media posts. For every lead they followed, the trail seemed to disappear. But when the murder of David Maland was linked to the Zizian cult, the stakes changed. No longer could the cult be dismissed as a fringe group. They were now a direct threat to public safety, and law enforcement had no choice but to escalate their efforts. The FBI responded with a full-scale investigation. But they faced several immediate challenges. The cult had become more sophisticated in their methods. They utilized encryption, multiple digital aliases, and an elaborate network of supporters to cover their tracks. Investigators quickly realized they were dealing with an organization that had mastered the art of evasion. Despite the challenges, the FBI assembled a special task force dedicated to breaking the case wide open. Agents worked around the clock, combing through digital evidence, surveillance footage, and analyzing any information that could give them a lead. The pressure to find the culprits weighed heavily on the task force as the public and media demanded answers. In addition to the digital challenges, law enforcement had to contend with the psychological tactics the cult employed. The Zizian Cult thrived on secrecy, and its members were conditioned to distrust authority. The hunt for the Zizian Cult had now become a nationwide operation. The FBI knew that every moment mattered. They were closing in on a group that had shown time and time again that they were willing to kill to make a point. The first breakthrough in the investigation had been made, but the case was far from over. As the FBI began to close in on the Zizian Cult's safe houses and recruitment hubs, the true scale of the threat began to reveal itself. The stakes were higher than ever before, and the investigation was on the verge of a major breakthrough. A significant breakthrough came from the analysis of footage from a series of attacks in San Francisco, which showed cult members wearing masks and making cryptic gestures. The images were grainy, but enough detail could be extracted to match faces to names. Investigators began to identify the cult's most influential figures, those who operated as the inner circle, coordinating operations from the shadows. One by one, the agents pieced together a list of the cult's core members. Some of them had criminal backgrounds, while others had been radicalized in recent years. The chilling realization dawned on the investigators: these weren't just misguided idealists, they were a highly organized, deeply dangerous group. The further investigators dug, the more they realized how well-coordinated and secretive the Zizian Cult was. As the investigation gained momentum, the FBI was able to trace the origins of the encrypted messages back to a series of online forums and secure messaging apps. It was here that the cult had recruited new members and spread their radical ideology. The messages, initially designed to stay hidden, now provided a roadmap to the cult's inner circle and their next violent targets. In one startling discovery, a list of names appeared, potential targets for the cult's next wave of violence. Among the names was the FBI agent leading the investigation. This revealed just how close the cult was to infiltrating law enforcement, making it clear that this was no ordinary group of criminals. The stakes were higher than ever. The cult had officially crossed a line, and it was now up to law enforcement to stop them. With the full scope of the cult's operations now exposed, the FBI began to move in. Armed with evidence, surveillance footage, and encrypted communications, they launched a series of coordinated raids. The cult's reign of terror was finally on the verge of being broken. In March 2025, after months of relentless surveillance and covert operations, the FBI launched a series of coordinated raids that would bring the Zizian Cult's reign of terror to an abrupt halt. The culprits behind the violence, including the cult's founder Jack LaSota, Michelle Zajko, and Daniel Blank, were arrested in a series of dramatic and carefully executed operations. The arrest of these key figures marked the end of the cult's brutal actions, but the damage they had caused to society would never be undone. Jack LaSota, the charismatic yet manipulative leader, was taken into custody at his secluded home in the woods. LaSota had spent years building his empire, preaching about purity, justice, and the destruction of humanity's oppressors. The arrest was a symbolic end to the nightmare he had created. Michelle Zajko, LaSota's right-hand woman, was arrested at a compound outside of Oakland, California. Zajko had been integral to the cult's operations, recruiting new members and helping orchestrate the violence. She was known for her chilling devotion to the cause, making her one of the most dangerous figures within the group. Daniel Blank, the third key figure in the cult, was found hiding in a remote cabin in Oregon. A former military strategist, Blank had been the mastermind behind many of the cult's violent operations. His military experience had made him invaluable to the group, helping to carry out their most deadly attacks. His capture signified the unraveling of the cult's military arm. The arrests were met with a mixture of shock and relief from the public. For the families of the victims, it was a long-awaited moment of justice. For the authorities, it was the end of a complex and deadly investigation. But for those who had lived through the terror of the cult's violent campaign, the pain and fear lingered far beyond the arrests. As the three leaders were led into custody, the FBI and local law enforcement began the difficult task of dismantling the rest of the cult's network. But as the investigation continued, it became clear that the Zizian cult had spread far beyond what anyone had imagined. The world watched as Jack LaSota, Michelle Zajko, and Daniel Blank were brought to trial. The question on everyone's mind was, how far had the cult's influence spread? And were there more members still out there, waiting for their moment to strike? For the first time in years, the people who had once been terrorized by the Zizian cult could begin to breathe a little easier. The end of the cult was within reach, but there was still more work to be done. What drives someone to embrace violence for a cause? For Jack LaSota, the transformation from a passionate activist to a fanatical cult leader didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual shift, one fueled by a deep sense of personal power and a distorted view of morality. In his mind, the world was a broken place, one that needed to be torn down and rebuilt. But for LaSota, rebuilding the world meant wielding power, control, and violence. And the cost of his vision? The lives of anyone who stood in his way. LaSota's ideology was rooted in a self-righteous conviction that he had the moral high ground. He saw himself as a savior, a crusader for the downtrodden. People who, in his view, had been trampled under the weight of human greed, exploitation, and environmental destruction. His speeches, once filled with passionate calls for justice, slowly shifted into a rhetoric of hatred and violence. The world had to be remade, and anyone who opposed that vision was an enemy. Psychologists who studied LaSota's rise to power believe that his radicalization was not solely based on his ideology, but rather on a mix of psychological factors. LaSota's early life was marked by feelings of alienation and a desire for significance. As an outsider, he found validation in the idea of leading a movement that would make him a figure of power, influence, and control. His message resonated with disenfranchised individuals who were searching for meaning, and it was in this vulnerability that LaSota found his greatest strength. Psychologist Dr. Emily Harris, an expert on radicalization, explains, LaSota wasn't simply preaching a cause. He was creating an identity for his followers, an identity based on victimhood and justified aggression. He gave them purpose, he made them feel important, that they were fighting for a world that was both broken and their responsibility to fix. For LaSota, his followers were not just recruits, they were tools to carry out his vision. And that vision was clear, the destruction of human oppressors and the creation of a new world order. In his speeches, LaSota's followers were encouraged to see themselves as warriors, with the righteous duty to fight and, if necessary, kill. The enemy was not just anyone, it was anyone who benefited from the exploitation of others, anyone who upheld what LaSota described as the corrupt societal structures. In private conversations with followers, LaSota further drilled into their psyche. He used techniques of emotional manipulation, creating an us versus them mentality. Those who joined the Zizian cult felt like they were part of an exclusive, morally superior group, and they began to see violence as an acceptable means of fulfilling their mission. But LaSota wasn't the only leader. His right-hand woman, Michelle Zajko, played a critical role in shaping the group's core beliefs. Zajko was just as fervently dedicated to the cause as LaSota, but her method was more subtle. While LaSota used open aggression to draw attention to the cult, Zajko worked behind the scenes, organizing the recruitment and training of members. It was Zajko who made the cult's radical message palatable to a larger audience, blending environmentalism with anti-government sentiments. For Zajko, the ends always justified the means. She believed the world was already in a state of collapse and that any violence committed in the name of saving it was justified. Zajko's psychological profile shows a combination of personal conviction and manipulative charm. She didn't just recruit followers, she turned them into loyal soldiers, willing to sacrifice everything for the cause. But the most chilling part of the Zizian cult's psychology was not just its leadership, it was how the ideology spread. It wasn't limited to Lasota and Zajko. It was the infectious nature of the cult's messages that appealed to people who felt powerless, people who believed they had been forgotten or victimized by society. And once they had joined, the cult rewired their perception of the world, turning every tragedy into fuel for radical change. What happens to a person who subscribes to such extreme ideologies? What happens when they begin to see violence as a solution, a necessary action? Dr. Harris argues that Lasota's followers were not inherently violent, they were manipulated into believing their violence was righteous. They were told that they were heroes, fighting a greater battle. As a result, many of them were willing to carry out unspeakable acts, believing they were doing good for the world. The psychological impact on the victims, too, cannot be ignored. Those who survived the cult's attacks or lost loved ones would be forced to confront the horrors of an ideology that justified violence for the sake of a twisted, delusional cause. The trauma caused by the cult's brutality extended far beyond the immediate physical harm. It affected communities, families, and individuals who were forever changed by the actions of a few radical minds. But as law enforcement closed in on the Zizian cult, the narrative of moral superiority was slowly dismantled. The truth about Lasota, Zajko, and Blank began to emerge, not as martyrs, but as manipulative figures, using their psychological prowess to coerce others into violent action. The violent uprising they had orchestrated was not a fight for justice, it was a quest for control and power, masked by the false guise of moral righteousness. The Zizian cult was not just about Jack Lasota, its power lay in the community it created. The group thrived on the vulnerability of its followers, individuals who felt marginalized, lost, or without purpose in a world that seemed indifferent to their struggles. Lasota promised them a place, a family, a sense of belonging in a society that had cast them aside. But what they found, in the end, was a web of manipulation, control, and a path to violence they could never have imagined. These were not people who set out to become killers. Many were disillusioned youth, students struggling with mental health issues, or workers who faced deep economic insecurity. They were desperate for a sense of identity and purpose, and the Zizian cult provided them with both. But as they became enmeshed in the group's ideology, their sense of self began to erode, replaced by the need to conform to Lasota's distorted worldview. For these individuals, Lasota was not just a leader, he was a savior. He presented himself as a guide to a better world, one where their pain and alienation could be understood and addressed. He gave them the feeling of being part of something bigger than themselves, a community that would fight to make the world a better place. In truth, he was simply exploiting their need for connection to build his own army of radicalized followers. Many members were recruited through online forums or small gatherings, where Lasota and his followers preached a message of environmental justice, social equity, and revolutionary change. But as they became more involved, their worldview shifted, and the line between activism and violence blurred. One of the most chilling aspects of the Zizian cult's success was its ability to isolate individuals from their families and support systems. As the cult's influence grew, members were encouraged to cut ties with the outside world. The real world became an enemy, a corrupt and oppressive force that could not be trusted. Slowly, the only voices they heard were those of Lasota and his inner circle, pushing them further into isolation and indoctrination. For many, it was a slow descent into psychological manipulation. Lasota knew that once he had established emotional control, he could make his followers believe anything. The ideology, once rooted in a sense of justice, was replaced by a brutal us versus them mentality. The followers became pawns in his radical vision, each convinced they were part of something monumental, a battle for the soul of humanity. But when the violence escalated and lives were lost, many followers began to question their beliefs. The cognitive dissonance they experienced was unbearable. They had been promised a new world, but what they were part of was a machine of destruction. The question became, was the cause worth the cost? Many found it impossible to reconcile their actions with their original beliefs, leaving them in emotional turmoil, isolated from the very community they had fought so hard to build. Some of the most heartbreaking stories come from former members who managed to escape. They described the deep sense of shame and regret they felt after realizing they had participated in atrocities. But these individuals also reflect on how they were systematically broken down, how their vulnerability was exploited and used against them. The psychological manipulation that occurred within the Zizian cult left scars that would last a lifetime. The story of the Zizian cult is not just the story of Jack LaSota's rise and fall, it's the story of how communities of vulnerable people can be drawn into dangerous ideologies. It's a warning about the power of manipulation and the fragility of the human psyche when left unchecked. And it's a story that, even after the cult's collapse, leaves questions about how many others out there are still waiting for someone to tell them they matter, even if that someone is dangerous. The Zizian cult's violent actions left behind more than just physical destruction, it left emotional scars on the victims' families and communities, wounds that may never heal. But as the dust settled, one thing became painfully clear: the cult was a reflection of a deeper, more troubling trend in modern society. A trend where activism, when manipulated by charismatic leaders, can slip dangerously into extremism, violence, and an ideology that disregards the value of human life. While the families of the victims grappled with the loss of loved ones, the larger society was forced to confront uncomfortable questions. How could a movement that began with noble ideals, fighting for animal rights and social justice, become so deeply corrupted? And how many other groups, operating under the guise of activism, were capable of crossing the same line into violence? The Zizian cult was not an isolated incident, it was part of a broader phenomenon where radical ideologies, amplified by social media and online communities, could spread like wildfire. The social media era has created an environment where ideas, both good and bad, can spread faster than ever before. It's a tool for social change, but also a breeding ground for extremist ideologies. LaSota and his followers capitalized on this. Their digital propaganda reached thousands, if not millions, convincing people that violence was not only justified but necessary. And it wasn't just isolated individuals who were influenced, it was entire networks of people, radicalized in the dark corners of the internet. While the immediate focus was on the cult's acts of terror, the long-term consequences were even more disturbing. Families of victims spoke out not only about their personal grief, but about the lasting impact on their communities. The cult may have been dismantled, but its effects on the people involved would linger for years. But perhaps the most unsettling question raised by the Zizian cult is, how does society prevent the next radical movement from taking root? It's easy to blame the cult's leaders, but the truth is that they were a product of a broken system. A system that allows disenfranchised, vulnerable individuals to fall prey to extremist ideologies. A system where online radicalization thrives unchecked, and where people with legitimate grievances are too often drawn into violent solutions. Experts argue that this intersection of activism and violence is not new, but it is growing more dangerous. The Zizian cult was a microcosm of a larger issue, where social justice movements can be co-opted by those with violent agendas. As the world becomes more connected, these movements have the potential to grow at an alarming rate. The Zizian cult's rise and fall served as a grim reminder of how quickly good intentions can turn deadly. Ultimately, the Zizian cult's legacy is one of destruction. But in its wake, it left a society forced to reconsider its approach to activism, radical ideologies, and the responsibility of online platforms in curbing extremist content. If there's one thing the Zizian cult taught us, it's that the line between activism and violence is thin, and it can be crossed in the blink of an eye. With the arrest of Jack LaSota, Michelle Zajko, Daniel Blank, and other key members of the Zizian cult, law enforcement finally brought the violent organization to an end. The world breathed a sigh of relief. The investigation into the Zizian cult was one of the most complex and far-reaching operations ever undertaken. But its resolution was bittersweet. Though the immediate threat was neutralized, the roots of radicalization run deep in many corners of the world. Communities must continue to be vigilant. Leaders and lawmakers must remain proactive, creating spaces where ideological differences are dealt with peacefully and constructively. For now, the cult is gone, but the echoes of its existence are still heard in the lingering fears, broken families, and the lessons we must never forget. As we close the book on the Zizian cult, we are left with a haunting reminder: the power of ideas, both good and bad. We must continue to stay vigilant, stay informed, and above all, stay compassionate to those who may be vulnerable to manipulation. Thank you for watching this video. For more in-depth investigations into true crime, stay tuned for future episodes, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.